It's the week ending Saturday the 21st of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the Taliban returning to power in Afghanistan after 20 years, the trial of singer R. Kelly beginning in New York, and the death of British comedian Sean Lock at the age of 58. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Julia O'Driscoll. From Money Week, Mr. John Stepek. And we welcome back freelancer Tomiwa Owolade. And John is kicking us off this week, so get your saving spreadsheets at the ready. John, what do you think this week should be remembered for?
Should pensioners get a massive COVID bonus?
The triple lock is the government's policy, but I very much recognise people's concerns. What I would say is the numbers that you mentioned at this point are speculation because we haven't actually got them yet. That happens later on. But I do recognise people's concerns on this. I think they are completely legitimate and fair concerns to raise. And what I would say when we look at this properly at the appropriate time, that your word is the right word, fairness. That will be absolutely driving what we do, and we want to make sure that the decisions we make and the systems we have are fair, both for pensioners and for taxpayers.
The distinctive tones of Chancellor Rishi Sunak speaking to BBC Breakfast last month. John, what's happened this week?
Well, this is all about the triple lock. So the pensions triple lock is a method of uprating the state, or raising the state pension age every single year to make sure that pensioners always get an increase in their real terms income. So there's 3 things that it's adjusted by. It'll either go up by 2.5%, or the annual inflation rate, or the increase in average earnings, whichever's the highest. Okay, so it's meant to keep pensioner standard of living rising in line with the cost of living.
And that's been government policy since 2010, hasn't it? And was in the Conservative Party manifesto in 2019.
Yes, and it has been contentious for a while, but they did kind of back it again in 2019. The specific problem this year, obviously, is that it's been quite an unusual year. So inflation is kind of rising at roughly 2%. Obviously, 2.5% is the other number, but average earnings is the figure that everyone's focusing on. And this week we just got the average earnings figure for June. Now, they use the July figure, so it's the one that's coming next month. But this week we heard that the June rise, average earnings are going up at 7.4% year on year. So it looks as if pensioners, if we stick to the triple lock, would get a rise of about 8% in the state pension in the year ahead.
Okay, and that's a problem because average earnings obviously don't tell the whole story at the moment.
No, because the things there's lots of statistical quirks, and I won't go into the details, but the upshot is that Thanks. I doubt there's anyone on this podcast who's actually had a raise of 7% in the last year. And if you have, I'd like to talk to you and learn your negotiating methods. It basically boils down to loads of people last year were on furlough and now they're coming off furlough. And so that's artificially inflated the statistics, and everyone knows that. Depending who you listen to, underlying pay growth is kind of estimated anything from about 2% to possibly as much as 5%, but certainly not 7 or 8%.
Okay, so Julia, you are one of these people who I'm going to presume your pay has not gone up by nearly 8%. Do you feel it's unfair if pensioners get a rise of that magnitude because of the triple lock? Because it was, as John was saying, it was formed to progressively increase pensions. That is its point. That's what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, I think this question of intergenerational fairness is really important. So a lot of people are saying that younger generations bore the financial brunt of the pandemic, whether it was through wage cuts, being on the furlough scheme, or redundancies as well. At the same time, pensioners have continued to receive their state contributions without any changes. So on the one hand, breaking the triple lock, maybe that does do something to kind of balance the books generationally. But on the other hand, if we do break the triple lock, I think this could be a problem for younger generations in years to come. So this is, potentially going to be a temporary measure because of the abnormalities in the last year and a half. But who's to say that this won't be permanent or that there'll be further changes to pension policy? So I think it's also important to think that it's affecting, actually, I think it's going to affect younger generations, whatever the decision is. And we need to, I think younger generations should be quite worried about what might happen if the triple lock is broken.
It's also worth bearing in mind, isn't it, Tom, what pensioners have been through over the last 18 months. I mean, should pensioners get a massive COVID boost, was John's introduction to this story. And you could argue they've had a massive COVID setback over the last year and a half, many of them living in fear whilst their friends die around them. Like, is it really so unreasonable, rather like with the plea to give NHS workers a pay rise above what otherwise would have been expected? Is it really that unreasonable to say to pensioners, actually, even if the statistics are a bit skewed, you probably deserve a bit more money at this point?
Yeah, you could make the argument that pensioners have had it worse than young people because, of course, pensioners are more likely to die than young people from COVID, and therefore they've been directly impacted on that basis. However, I don't think it's a case of saying that this is unfair on its own terms with regard to pensioners. It's just that it's unfair relative to young people. And I think more significant than that is the case of how the government can actually fund it. So if it does go through, it will be a case of the government breaking its own back to subsidize pensioners, a group of people that are already far more wealthier than younger generations. And throughout the lockdown itself, government borrowing has increased equivalent to 14.2% of GDP, which is the highest figure since the Second World War. So it's a case of the government going through its own crisis to subsidize a group that are already the wealthiest in the country.
Yes, and so maybe, John, this discussion, and we've just fallen into the trap of framing this as about fairness, actually rather suits Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson, because they can say, well, the game's changed, it's about fairness now to level the playing field, whereas actually some suggest it might just be they couldn't afford not to dismantle the triple lock now.
Well, yeah, I mean, Tom's making a really good point there. At the end of the day, you can argue about how much of a deficit and how much debt is sustainable, and there's lots of arguments about that. But we still have to pick and choose. If money actually matters, then why are we choosing to spend 3 to 4 extra billion that we don't need to on the basis of a statistical glitch? And I think that is the other issue. It's easy to start making this about intergenerational warfare or about fairness. There's a kind of slightly more fundamental thing, which is that we literally just had a once-in-a-generation pandemic, and it has caused a mathematical problem that everyone can see. If it wasn't for the politics surrounding this, it'd be obvious. Of course we shouldn't give people this raise, because this is not what it was ever intended to do, and we're not going to have a pandemic every year. I mean, fingers crossed. The problem is you drag in lots of things, because obviously there's a lot of people who want to use this as a stick to beat the government with either way, and also sorry, I've totally lost the thread of what I was going to say. But yeah, I think it's that you've got to separate the politics of it from the actual practicalities, and the practicalities are straightforward. This is a one-off statistical glitch. It's easy to put right. Nobody's going to get hard done by. Pensioners are still going to get a real terms increase regardless. It's just not going to cost us quite as much money.
Well, the cost, Julia, is political, isn't it, potentially, to the Conservative Party? You know, older people tend to vote Conservative, or more likely to vote Conservative than for any other party. Do you think this is a risky political move for them?
Yeah, I do. I think, as we were saying, obviously this was a 2019 manifesto pledge by the Conservatives. And, pensioners and older demographics are loyal voters. They also are a demographic that turns out in high numbers for elections as well. So doing anything that could dissuade that voter base, could be a really risky move. And I think at the moment we're seeing the Conservatives in a slightly interesting position. They've lost seats, in previous strongholds like Chesham and Amersham to the Liberal Democrats earlier this year, but they've also won seats in the Red Wall, such as in Hartlepool. So there's kind of this fine balancing line of needing to kind of maintain the support of those newly won seats in those constituencies, but also almost probably wanting to win back the support in those newly lost seats. So I think anything like this, which is so divisive and clearly has attracted a lot of attention already, could be quite a risky move.
Although, Tom, to borrow one of the Prime Minister's own phrases, if not now, when? There's no sign. I mean, OK, people might be voting Liberal Democrat, but that's not going to really threaten them, is it? There's no sign that the people are about to defect to Labour that are voting Conservative. They've got a majority. And actually, they have just given all pensioners priority in the vaccine programme, so you could balance that against this as well, couldn't you? You sort of think they might be able to get away with this now in a way they wouldn't have before.
Yeah, they could just cite it, as John put it, as a quirky incident, something which is extraordinary and something which is unlikely to ever happen again, fingers crossed. And therefore, that could be the case for trying to persuade pensioners who might see this as a sort of renege on a promise made by the Conservative Party to them. I think another problem is that the Labour Party at the moment are not really threatening the Conservative Party in the polls, and neither are any other party. So I do think that it's not going to damage support amongst pensioners for the Conservative Party in any significant way.
Are other countries battling with this kind of decision, though, John? I mean, everyone's had to make cutbacks, everyone's had to borrow a lot of money, everyone has a growing, ageing population, or at least in Europe.
I mean, this one, the thing is, the triple lock is an unusual artifact of UK politics. So the answer is not really not grappling with this specific issue. I mean, obviously, ageing populations and pension payouts are a big deal. It's a perpetual sort of thing about, well, how are we going to pay for all this? And certainly in terms of, the pension age going up, our own pension age is now going up to 66. It's going up to 67 soon, and it'll go up to 68 by 2037. Although I bet you it will go up faster than that. So how to pay for ageing populations is a big deal everywhere. But this specific issue is basically just in the UK, and it does arise as a kind of statistical artifact. I mean, it's difficult to compare pension systems across the world as well, because one thing that people have said quite a lot is that, we should be raising this because the UK state pension is among the least generous in the world. But that is kind of a misconception that arises from looking at an old OECD study that tries to compare pensions between countries. But the thing is, the UK's private pension system is much bigger than a lot of other countries' systems. And by that, I just mean, particularly now that we've got auto-enrolment, where which is effectively mandatory saving for anyone who's working. Our pension system doesn't look anywhere near as bad as it can do if you're using those oranges and apples comparisons. So again, it's as I say, it's a strange little issue that is unique to Britain at this particular point in time, which is another reason why I think it's quite easy politically, if somebody's just got a little bit of backbone, to just stand up and say, look, this is a one-off. Let's just accept it.
I mean, finally on this, John, why do you think the triple lock actually is unique to Britain? I mean, I appreciate, the British government innovated the policy, but why has no one tried to imitate it for the last 11 years? Is it not really deemed to be a successful bit of economic intervention?
It's expensive. Really, the triple lock is effectively saying we're going to give pensioners an above-inflation increase every single year. Now, I'll be honest, I can't remember why the coalition introduced it beyond it would have been a vote winner. But it does mean that, so every single year your pension bill is going up by even more than technically it needs to. Now, I don't have a massive problem with that. We should look after our pensioners. But at the same time, it's also interesting. I remember 20 years ago, whenever you felt sorry for pensioners, and they really were impoverished relative to the rest of the country. But that has changed dramatically over the last 20 years, which is a good thing. In the kind of 2001, if you look at Joseph Rowntree Foundation figures, pensioners were more likely than any other group than single-parent families to be living in poverty. And now they are the least likely to be living in poverty. And that's great, that's excellent, and that is partly to do, it's not entirely to do, but it's partly to do with the fact that they've been getting real terms increases every year. But the point is, well, it's politically popular at first, and then the problem is people then take it for granted, so you can't take it away. But it does mean you've got a mountain pensions bill every single year. So it makes the demographic issue much, much harder.
Yes, probably not the last we've heard of this. Okay, Julia, you're up next after this. Okay, Julia, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Can naming and shaming stop people from taking drugs?
It's used throughout society. There is no actual profile of a cocaine user in the UK.
It's just socially acceptable these days. It is a Class A drug, and I found out that the hard way.
It's the open secret. And that's what it is. It's an open secret.
But for the first time, we're able to show you the immense quantities we consume.
We don't talk about cocaine because everyone's taking it. It's sort of recreational, you know.
That's the word.
It's recreational.
Why isn't it recreational?
Because
what's wrong with it?
It destroys lives.
Various voices talking to Cocaine, Britain's Open Secret, a Sky News documentary from 2019. Julia, what's the story this week?
So this week, a police source has told the Times newspaper that the Home Secretary wants police to name and shame middle-class drug users. And the move is framed as a crackdown on the recreational use of Class A drugs. So there's a perception at the moment, according to sources and Priti Patel, that people can take Class A drugs without punishment. And so there's quite a high level of recreational use of drugs such as cocaine without people fearing persecution. And they're looking to change this.
What does naming and shaming actually mean, though? If you're not arresting people and charging them with something, I mean, what's the suggested process?
It's a very good question, and details are lacking, but arrests are one way that people will apparently be shamed. Another form of shaming that's mentioned by a Home Office source to the newspaper was that university students may also find themselves targeted in a kind of naming and shaming tactic. So police are going to supposedly target university freshers, and one consequence could be that students are expelled from university. And the phrasing was slightly odd, something like go home with your tail between your legs to mum and dad, which seems a very different form of shaming to kind of the high-profile arrest that maybe one would initially think Priti Patel is hoping that the tactic might achieve.
Tom, last year there were 4,561 drug-related deaths recorded in Britain, which is the highest tally since records began. So if that's the goal, really, ultimately, to stop those deaths, the current policy isn't working, and everyone agrees that, but is this the tweak that it needs?
The government link a lot of, especially youth violence, so night violence, with what's known as county lines, which is vulnerable young people being exploited to sell drugs and to traffic drugs. I think the issue is that county lines and a lot of the violence associated with the drug trade is associated with crack cocaine and heroin rather than cocaine. So I think one of the key things that the government has emphasized, and many other people have emphasized, is the notion of cocaine being used by hypocritical metropolitan rich liberals, and they are themselves funding this crisis in youth violence. But the reality is more so that this youth violence crisis is funded largely by other types of drugs.
Yeah, and John, obviously middle-class drug users affect a supply chain, and I'm sure that exploits vulnerable people overseas especially. But those young people in the UK, as Tom was suggesting, I mean, they're mostly, it seems to me, I'm generalising hugely here obviously, but it mostly seems to be sort of teenagers on council estates selling drugs to known addicts. That's a very different thing, isn't it, to someone ordering off the deep web some cocaine to come to their party at university. Those people aren't dying because of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's idiotic grandstanding, and it's typical of the sort of garbage that comes out about the war on drugs that we've had for decades now. It's actually pathetic that we're still having this conversation about these things. It's very, very clear that if anyone gives a toss what the solution to the drug problem is, and it's decriminalisation and even legalisation, because it doesn't work. And also this stuff about cocaine, Scotland had record numbers of drug deaths last year, and Scotland is far, far worse on a per capita base than any other European country, including England and Wales. And all the people there are dying from things like these kind of opioid-related drugs, jellies, temazepam, that sort of thing. I mean, yeah, cocaine is a problem in terms of, getting your fair trade, kind of like Colombian stuff or whatever. But this is not a middle-class issue. The kinds of drugs that we talk about that are high profile are not the ones that are killing the most people. And our kind of like tactics for dealing with it are hopelessly confused, and they have been for ages. And you would think that with America increasingly legalising things like cannabis, we would be stepping a little bit more towards the idea of treating this as a health problem rather than a kind of crime issue, and getting their heads around the fact that if you create a black market, you just give all the money to the criminals. But clearly we're not. Clearly we're stuck with the same old drivel we've always had about it.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, Julia? Because in a way, this links to the previous story in a sense that it's the same sort of Telegraph reading Conservative voting pensioners that are being appealed to by this line. When John says we're not changing our opinion, I get the sense that British public opinion is slowly changing towards something like what John's talking about. But that remaining refuge of voters are still very firmly tied to the idea that drugs should be treated in this way.
I think that's very true, but there is a sense that this is just, as John was saying, a lot of hot air. Actually, in an article this week, the New Statesman said there's a feeling that government is producing more hot air than actual policy at the moment, which I think this is a really good example of, particularly if we're seeing that kind of the greatest effect of a name and shame tactic on Class A drugs would be felt by the individual charged, rather than actually looking at how the country can better manage the exploitation of vulnerable children and adults in domestic drug trafficking. There's a lot more work that needs to be done in combating those networks, but also in terms of global supply chains. And so some senior law enforcers, kind of in response to the news this week, have said that actually a much better move is going to be looking at global networks and supply chains. But this is obviously a much more difficult task that requires international cooperation and funding. It's a much harder game to play.
There's inevitably as well going to be an accusation of hypocrisy here, isn't there, Tom? I mean, William Hague, former leader of the Conservative Party, of course, is now a columnist for The Times. He's one of those voices that I'm thinking of when I say that the tide is changing. He wrote in The Times a few weeks ago, look at Portugal, they've decriminalised drugs, that's the way we need to go. And he said when he was leader of the Tories in the late 90s, I think he said a third of his shadow cabinet admitted to once taking drugs. It would be far-fetched to assume that the same wouldn't be said now. We know that Boris Johnson's taken drugs, that Michael Gove has taken drugs.
Yeah, exactly. There is a case of hypocrisy. And also with something like this, the most vulnerable people, the people that are most likely to actually suffer as a consequence of this naming and shaming, will be the most disadvantaged people in society. I find it very unlikely that a middle-aged, middle-class person going to a dinner party is actually likely to be affected by this naming and shaming, but perhaps a vulnerable young student, maybe motivated by peer pressure, will be vulnerable to it. So it's a case of not actually prioritizing or not actually focusing on the most powerful people in a society that take drugs, but disadvantaging more so the most disadvantaged people.
I think there's also, as you're saying, Tom, kind of a really odd use of the term middle class when it comes to university students. So the assumption that any student at university is just by default middle class. You know, you could have a student from a working class background who gets to university and on their first weeks they're the target of, you know, a name and shame tactic. It's just completely unfair and, again, doesn't really get to the heart of the much bigger issue on this.
But also, they haven't changed the laws regarding stop and search, have they? Like, the police wouldn't have enough justification to be parading around Kensington and Chelsea, stopping middle-class people on the way to dinner parties, would they? They need some evidence. They need to say there's a reason I'm stopping you to look in your pockets.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, what Tom was saying about the idea of kind of people at dinner parties ringing the police on their friends. I mean, it's not going to happen. So what does this actually look like?
What do you think it looks like, John, if you fast forward enough? And you're obviously frustrated at the current drugs policy, but do you sense that things will be different in, say, 20 years' time?
I hope so. I mean, I do think that as soon as your average government gets the idea that it might be able to make up a whole load of tax revenue from things like cannabis legalisation, for example, then you're starting on something approaching a more sensible way to do things. I mean, going back to Scotland as well, I mean, the other thing is that people are up in arms about the sheer volume of deaths there. I mean, it's like something like 3.5 times worse than it is down here. So I think that, you know, there's a kind of tipping point there where they're going to have to treat it as a public health crisis because that's what it is. But, you know, I mean, Portugal decriminalised, 20 years ago? It's seen no real downsides and kind of mostly upsides. You know, that's just decriminalisation. So we aren't talking about being able to get crack over the counter at Boots here. We are just talking about taking a more sensible approach to it, acknowledging that people are going to take these substances. Whoever was getting interviewed on that video at the start was saying that cocaine ruins lives. Alcohol ruins lives. It ruins a lot more lives. I'm certainly not for banning it, low, because, I drink plenty of it without any problems. So, I just think we have to take an adult approach. And I hope that in 20 years' time, we will be having a more sensible conversation about it. I mean, I did hope that 20 years ago as well, though.
But just finally on this, Tom, I mean, if you do decriminalise, but you don't legalise, so if you don't have it over the counter at Boots, as John was saying, but you just say you're not going to get arrested for taking it, you don't deal with the supply chain issue that we did talk about, and that is something the government has to deal with. If you are someone who buys fair trade bananas, there isn't an equivalent in cocaine, and that, people are put in the position of being hypocrites on that, aren't they? Because they are casual drug users while it remains illegal.
Yeah, another thing is that many drugs are now bought digitally, so through the dark net. And I think that's also significantly increased during the lockdown as well. Even drug dealers are trying to maintain social distancing. How can the government deal with the dark net and deal with trying to curb the sale of drugs in the digital realm? I think it's interesting because there was a survey which was released this year that shows how just resilient the drug market has been over the past 18 months. And 43% of people that were surveyed said they've increased their drug use compared to 21% who said the drug use has been reduced. So it will be interesting to see how the government not only deals with drug use in general, but in particular with the change in way in which drugs are supplied and sold.
Yeah, I know I've increased my alcohol consumption since March 2020. Tom, I'm coming to you next after this. Right, Tom, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A journey of mammoth proportions.
Can you see that tree there? Mm-hmm. That has been broken by an elephant.
Nahimsa Campos Arcias, an elephant expert here, figures they're going further to seek out food. They eat 400 pounds of it a day.
Grasses, bamboo, wild bananas, palms, they will just be on the move continuously. And they cannot spend too much in a place because they will consume all the resources.
Janice McKay-Freyer reporting for NBC Today from Beijing last week. Tom, what's the story?
So for the past 17 months, a wandering herd of 14 elephants in the Yunnan province of China has embarked on an adventure up north. So they've actually left their nature preserve and they've been traveling up north and also wrecking villages, munching on crops, crashing into people's houses as well, wandering around several streets and cities. And one of the causes for this is the growing elephant population in the province, which has led to a greater competition for food.
Okay, but that's got to be a good news story, really, hasn't it? Elephants were in decline. They were being protected, weren't they, in this area of China? So it's a success story that there's so many of them, they're competing for food, I guess.
Yeah, it's a success story for them, but I don't think it's a success story for the people who've had their homes crashed into and their crops destroyed. And we've just had to basically deal with the issue. And also the authorities as well. They've had to spend so much money and resources trying to curb the issue and trying to bring the elephants back. So the elephants have caused an estimated $1 million in damages. Over 150,000 people have actually been evacuated from their homes as well.
Where are they now then? Are they a danger to people or are they back?
They're coming back. So on Sunday, they've crossed over the Wanjiang River, which is the river returning them back to their particular nature reserve in the Yunnan province. The hope is that they go back and they stay back and don't wander off again.
It's so interesting, Julia, because I was shocked to hear that those people have been evacuated because, as much as I've seen any footage of this, it's sort of a kind of viral comedy meme. Like, here are some baby elephants walking around a city. People usually put sort of charming music on it. The BBC News article that I saw written about it was comparing it to Fellowship of the Ring. But actually, 150,000 people having to leave their homes is a big threat.
Yeah, I mean, elephants are going to go where they want to go. They're very determined animals moving in herds. And I think, humans aren't going to stop them in their tracks. And even the efforts that were put into getting them back to their nature reserve were incredibly intensive and not successful for a while. I think it's taken a few attempts to get them to go back. So, yeah, it is interesting because there's kind of this really wonderful human story side of it as well, particularly given the backdrop of the last 18 months where we've all kind of been lacking entertainment, potentially. And these elephants have kind of become minor celebrities. They're viral on TikTok. They're everywhere and kind of bringing smiles to people. But yeah, it does slightly, that side has slightly outbalanced actually the damage that's been caused. And it does raise a much bigger issue about what's going to happen with growing animal populations if there isn't the space to accommodate them comfortably.
Yeah, I mean, presumably they could become threatened as a species again themselves, John. And we're talking about China here. You know, there is a trade in tusks. You know, people do eat pretty much every animal around. So if these animals weren't celebrities being followed on TikTok, you do wonder what would have happened to them.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it just shows you how difficult conservation is. It's because conservation efforts for near extinct animals quite often do become successful once we start focusing on it. You know, and there's plenty of like birds that used to be endangered in Britain that now aren't. And I guess it's just, well, what do you do when you've, you know, technically kind of interfered on the other side? You know, and now we've got a situation where, yes, this little patch of nice land that we put aside for the elephants isn't big enough for them. And unfortunately, we can't take any more land from anyone else. And certainly, I mean, this sort of thing obviously has happened in Africa too. And there, you know, sometimes, you know, they end up having, you know, economic incentives for culls and things like that. And so, I mean, obviously, I don't know what to do about it. But yeah, this kind of management is really difficult. And it's also interesting in terms of the rewilding sort of idea that's very big just now. You know, I quite like the idea of rewilding, but it's kind of, well, what happens once you've got, you know, a pack of wolves that's just kind of like breaking out of the reserve and going onto the farmland and things like that? You know, it's fascinating.
Very refreshing of you as well to admit that it's slightly beyond your brief at Money Week, managing the environmental consequences of species of elephants in China. Tom, why do you think it's significant? I mean, you've chosen this as your story of the week. It is sort of sweet and interesting, but so what?
I think one interesting aspect of this story is that the Chinese government have actually been using the story as state propaganda. So in an editorial for the newspaper The Global Times, which is a state propaganda organ of the Chinese Communist Party, they've said that China's care for wandering elephants mirrors an adorable national image that the West can't distort. So it's a demonstration of how cute and how viralable, if that's a word, the Chinese nature reserves can be. And so it's essentially a form of soft power, which demonstrates how the Chinese can compete against the West and America in particular.
Going back to what John was saying earlier about how we manage kind of overpopulation, particularly with elephants, if we look at Botswana, so since 2019, Botswana began allowing the hunting of elephants again due to its overpopulation. So it has the world's largest population of elephants, over 130,000. And it's too many. It was affecting local communities, as we've heard in this story, similar issues in terms of resources, suffering in terms of food and water, and of course space. So the way that that's being combated is that now 287 licenses have been granted so that people can hunt the animals. So it's a really difficult thing from a conservationist point of view. Where's the limit, and how there isn't necessarily an indication of how many licenses should be allowed, you know, what population levels should be kept at, which makes this quite tricky.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, and it can be useful because at the end of the day, this is a resource, particularly for poorer countries. I mean, China's not going to be bothered about that, I wouldn't have thought, but it can be a useful economic resource. But the other tricky thing, though, is because we increasingly are anti things like hunting, and nobody wants to be the guy that shot Cecil the lion, even if they did it legally. I do sort of wonder how sustainable even that particular route is in time, because it doesn't look good in more privileged parts of the world to have people running around with kind of mounted elephant heads, even if they're doing a public service, technically.
Yeah, I mean, do you think these particular elephants, Tom, now they are celebrities across China, have kind of become untouchable? They're a bit like Cecil the lion. People will track them for years?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. At a global level, And I think at a sort of state national level amongst the Chinese people that want to sort of use them as global icons. But I think that will be less of the case for the 150,000 people that actually had to be evacuated from their homes and the people who've had their property damaged.
Well, with that, we end our epic journey through the news. No baby elephants were harmed. My thanks to John, Julia and Tom for their stories. Remember to follow this show for free. Just search for The Week Unwrapped, wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.